hello everybody. As I just mentioned, my name is Pelle. I've done debating for a long time now, 5 years at EDS, and then a lot of years in high school as well. And today I'm going to be talking to you about refutation or rebuttal. There are similar concepts. I'll get into that in a second. The way things are going to work is that we only have an hour and 45 minutes, unfortunately. I could talk for hours, and I really will. So I've got to try and stay focused on everything. But if you have any questions, just make sure you raise your hand, and then I'll finish what I was talking about, and I'll give you the floor. Luckily, there's only a small number of students, so we should have plenty of time for discussion and talking about examples. I'm also going to add some interaction, of course, so just be ready for that. Oh, and if you need to leave for any reason, like going to the bathroom or anything like that, just go ahead and go. And that's it. Okay, great. Let's get started. Fun times. There we go. Wonderful. All right, so first we're going to be talking about what is rebuttal. This is an example argument. Luckily, with the legalization of marijuana, we'll have far less legalization of marijuana debates in the future, hopefully, but for now, it is still a topic that keeps coming up. So the motion is this House would legalize marijuana. This is the structure you've already been taught, of course, in previous lectures. So the basics of it are simple, right? We're using the grounds or the data here. Millions of dollars of marijuana are currently sold illegally. The analysis that we take is like, well, so there is definitely a marijuana trade. Government can tax legal trade. So if you make marijuana trade legal, you can get a lot of government revenue. What does that mean? You would allow the government to provide more services for its citizens. So the impact in this case would be something like, I don't know, more benefits for the unemployed, better healthcare for people on like low-cost insurance, etc., etc. Yeah, how would you refute this argument or rebuttal to use EDS language?
I go into the fact that even if there's a legal way to get marijuana, that doesn't mean a person will not just go to their old dealer.
Right. So which part of the argument are you attacking then?
The claim.
Why? Why the claim specifically?
Just the easiest thing to rebut.
Okay. No, but like, why does what you just said, right? So just because someone can now buy marijuana legally doesn't mean they won't buy it illegally. Why does that specifically attack the claim?
Because it says it will increase government revenues, and I'm saying that actually won't matter that much at the end. Right.
Well, in that sense, you're attacking part of what the warrant is, right? The claim is more like these marijuana will increase government revenue. There is some part of it, and you're attacking essentially the connection between the warrant and the claim. Why is what you're doing? Why is that a rebuttal and not an opposing argument?
Because I'm directly taking what they said and pointing out why it's wrong.
Exactly. So when we have a motion, you guys have already heard about argumentation, of course. We usually make arguments on one side and arguments on the opposing side. But when you're doing rebuttal or refutation, you're specifically attacking parts of the argument in front of you in order to defeat that. So whenever you can think of any argument that would just address the motion. So for example, sure, if you legalize marijuana, we'll have more driving accidents. People will be driving high. That's something that is relevant to the motion. It's actually a good opposition argument, but you're not rebuttaling or refuting anything because you're not attacking their arguments themselves. That's a crucial difference, and that's why today we'll mostly be looking at what part of an argument are we attacking and how are we doing it. Does that make sense? Wonderful. Okay. So, rebuttal is an argument with the goal of proving a different argument to be false or less impactful. It's possible to refute any and all parts of an argument, obviously, or you can attack all of it, but you can attack it in a lot of different ways, or you can choose for one if you believe you've already pretty much destroyed it. We'll get into a lot of the strategy later. You can also attack a claim by giving an opposite claim and giving a reason. That's more of an opposition argument, but a warrant or analysis can be attacked stating there's a problem with underlying logic. So this is what Bianca was just doing. She was pointing out why one thing, option A, cause A might not lead to result B. I'm attacking your analysis there. We'll get more into that right here. So grounds, which is the data that we just saw, right? There's billions of dollars trade in marijuana a year, legally normally. We tend not to focus on this in EDS debates. You probably have noticed this. When people are making claims about facts, they tend to make pretty reasonable claims that we then attack in passing. But if you do too much of that, you're just yelling at each other. So let's say I say there's billions of trading marijuana every year, right, legally. You say it's not billions. Then there's really nothing much more we can say to each other besides giving, like, we can say there's studies and you're lying and this is not true. But unless there's like a fact checker on the board of a judging panel or in the room if you're having normal arguments, we're not likely to resolve that as an issue. So only when you think, okay, this is really a wrong fact, and by like I have to disprove it, otherwise their whole argument stands. Think of something like, well, if people smoke marijuana, they'll inevitably start using heroin, right? Like we've seen studies that people who smoke marijuana like will end up using heroin. If that was true, then why would we ever legalize marijuana? But it isn't. So then you have to try and say, okay, those grounds are not true. Like there might be some people again and again. So there is a reason to attack grounds. But if you see an actual fact, you're often better off leaving it alone and focusing on analysis. Anecdotes and examples. This is the most common way of arguing. I was just talking to you guys about this. A lot of times when we are trying to give an example of like, let's give a COVID example. Well, you know, yeah, maybe we should do a test, but my buddy did a test and it was false positive. So, you know, maybe they're useless. You're giving a single example and you're basing your actions or your argumentation on that. Very flawed, right? It can be persuasive because people are, you know, just listening to you for simple stuff. But in general, it usually doesn't hold up to any kind of scrutiny because you could give an example of a lot of tests that were working. That's when you need to use analysis, you need to use logic, you need to use some facts. So grounds based on anecdotes or examples, weak. We'll get more into that when we talk about fallacies. Impact is my favorite part because understanding the proper use of impacts and how to defeat them is a way to really become better at deconstructing debates as you look at them. Impacts are one of the most crucial things about an argument, and yet people often start getting confused with disproving an argument. They start getting into a lot of complicated like arguments that they can't really understand anymore because they don't really understand what impact is. But first, we'll get into not proven versus disproven. So if we're simply saying an argument isn't true, right? So legalizing the marijuana trade will provide a lot of revenue towards the government, right? Because they can tax it. If we're saying that isn't true, we're essentially saying that we can either say that there's not enough evidence. We can say you can't prove that this argument is true, or we can say that we know it isn't. It's a difference between you don't have enough evidence versus disproving a claim fully. Now, we happen to be in a semi-court situation here, so it actually works out pretty well for us. The most famous example of that is you're innocent until proven guilty. You're not saying that, like, when you're a defense attorney and you're defending your client, you don't have to prove yourself that your client didn't do it. You don't have to prove that there's someone else who did it, right? Like, oh, it wasn't my client Bob, it was Jack. You just have to prove that the prosecutor hasn't proven that it was your client. So in this case, you can also do that with argumentation. Sometimes when someone presents an argument, you don't even have to go into like, I know it isn't true, and here's all the reasons why it isn't true. You can simply point out they haven't proven it themselves. They don't have enough data, they haven't given enough analysis. I don't think it's true, and they haven't proven that it is true. And this can be crucial when you think an opponent has made a fairly weak argument, or when the situation is a little bit ambiguous on either side, right? If the argument might be true or might not be true, we simply can't know, then it can be really difficult to disprove it. A good example of that when people claim, I don't know, how many of you have read Harry Potter? Or seen it? Okay. Oh, okay. So at some point they're talking about mythical creatures that exist, and Lewis says, well, you can't prove that they don't exist, right? Well, I think they're real and they're invisible, so you can never find them, so they must exist because you can't prove they're not there. There's no way to argue with that, because if they can keep coming up with different attributes that this mythical creature might have, and you'll never be able to find it. So in that situation, the strongest thing you can point out is you haven't proven it's there, ergo it isn't. You have to prove it. I don't have to prove that it isn't there. I could use a God example, but that can get a little bit controversial, so I'm going to move past that one. All right. Yeah, as I hope the example made clear, it's important because the threshold of saying something is not proven is lower than the threshold of saying something is disproven. Soft versus hard rebuttal. What I was just talking about is hard rebuttal. That means trying to prove that something isn't true or has not been proven to be true. But soft rebuttal is about weakening the impacts. Louise, can you give me an example of soft rebuttal? Someone else who's done some debating? Stop rebuttals or attacking an opponent's impact? Yeah, go ahead.
Would be claiming that legalizing marijuana would lead to way smaller increase in government revenue than claimed by the.
Yes, exactly. You got it. So that's much more about marginalizing the impact and making sure that even if the argument is true, it doesn't really impact the debate as much. And this is crucial. Understanding this is a good way to understand why a lot of debates can get very mixed up, because you start talking about whether something is true at all or whether something will have a large impact, right? When people talk about the marijuana legalization debate and they make an argument like people speaking more marijuana will lead to more drunk driving, you could try and prove that there's not a single person that will drive while high on marijuana, right? Or you can say, okay, maybe there will be a few people that get high and start driving around. That's a problem. It won't be a lot of them. They won't do a lot of damage, and it'll be far less, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then you're minimizing the impact. You don't have to prove that it isn't true at all for nobody. You just have to prove it's not going to be a large group. Let's get more into that. Let's talk about the reason that's strategic. It's because a lot of times arguments might be slightly true, especially if we're having a very reasonable debate, right? Most political debates you see, there are some exceptions like giant walls being built or whether the earth is flat or not. But most debates you see tend to be between pretty reasonable people that are supporting both sides of an issue that you can actually find arguments for on both sides. So the temptation to try and prove that nothing your opponent is saying is true can be strong out of an effort like, well, I need to disprove all of their arguments, or I need to prove that they haven't proven any of their arguments. What we can also often do is strategically choose to just undermine their impacts. With marijuana, you've proven that there's going to be a lot of like millions and millions of extra tax revenue. I can't prove nobody will drive while on high on marijuana. I can only prove that there will be a few of them, and therefore the money weighs more heavily on my side. You're being strategic and you're thinking it through when it comes to what part of your opponent's arguments are you attacking. Let me demonstrate that. Yeah, this is exactly what we just talked about. It is impossible to guarantee that the government gaining more revenue would lead to an increase in spending on important services for citizens. So even though there might be a lot of money made from from legalizing marijuana trading and taxing it, you can't actually prove that the impact will be very good for its citizens, because they might just be spent on tax cuts for the rich, etc., etc. Right? You're trying to argue now about the consequences of all the truths that have been turned around the debate, far less than you're trying to argue about the arguments themselves. Does this make sense, or do I need to come up with a different example still?
It does.
Cool. All right, wonderful. Wait. Normally I would draw like a little triangle here, but this time we're doing it with a PowerPoint, so it's going to be a lot better. The comparison of impacts from opposing sides in the debate, arguing certain impacts matter more than others, right? It's a type of framing, essentially. You're trying to describe the importance of arguments. Now, this is what we just talked about, how it's difficult to disprove arguments that are well constructed, right? Like we just give two examples of taxes and driving while high. People also have a feeling usually for the truth lies in the middle ground. This can be a fallacy. We can get to that. That's the golden mean fallacy. But in general, people usually feel that two reasonable people are arguing, the truth might be somewhere in the middle. By weighing explicitly in front of them, by writing it down explicitly, you are giving into that instinct and still trying to prove that your side is won. So you seem much less reasonable when you say, nobody's going to drive while high, well, I'm going to make billions and billions of dollars and spend it on healthcare for poor people. You seem a lot more reasonable and therefore usually more persuasive. You say, there might be a few people who drive high, but all the money we'll make is going to do a lot of good. You've now explicitly weighed, okay, there are negative consequences to my action. There are negative consequences to legalizing marijuana, but the benefits outweigh the harms. Now, these things sometimes have a large degree of what I would in Dutch would call open deurgehalte. In English, I guess I would translate it to you're kicking in a lot of open doors. You're saying a lot of stuff that seems pretty obvious because, well, most people think they do this already. But when you do it explicitly, when you write arguments, you'll start to notice how much stronger they become, especially if you do it during your speech. You'll notice that rather than, okay, I'm giving an argument, they're giving an argument, I'm giving an argument, they're giving an argument, and then let's say you're doing a judge debate, the judges will decide which one weighed more. If you start weighing it in your own speech, you'll see a lot of people start to become much more convinced because you've just given them the thing they can say. People that do a really good job at this, they'll often hear a judge repeat their own words back to them. At the end of your speech, you'll say, well, Macy said a lot of good points about how people are going to be driving while high. I've explained to you why there's going to be a small number of people who are doing that. While on my side, there's a much larger government revenue that we can do a lot of good with. So because both are true, because I have many more benefits on my side and she can prove there are harms, you should be voting for me. And then when the judges come back with a decision later on, they literally say something along that lines. Well, we believe both of you, but Pelle's seem to be a lot more important and have a lot more benefits, so we decided that we should do it. This is also true, by the way, in regular meetings outside of the day. You do that every day, right? I see you have a lot of good points, but overall, I think the option I'm in favor of has more good points. Therefore, you should pick my option. It's very nice, but still ask the question, what are we exactly weighing, right? What is the good or the bad thing, and how do we actually prove them? Metrics. We can use several metrics to compare impact, right? And this makes sense to you if you immediately start thinking about it in a philosophical sense, right? We tend to use utilitarianism when we talk in debate, right? The most good for the most people, yada, yada, yada. That's usually the simplest thing. There are some people who argue with principles. We won't get into that too much today because it gets a little bit messy and a lot more complicated. In this case, we're going to talk about different metrics that we might be using over each other. So, for example, actors versus impact. That refers to, are we talking about the total impact on people? So, for example, under my side, 500 people will be hurt, and on his side, there will be 1,000 people hurt. Or are we talking about the kind of people that hurt? If I can prove that on my side, 20 children will get hurt, and on his side, 100 prisoners, people might still be more in favor of me because they care a lot more about children than a prisoner. So we're also talking about the metrics that we use when we weigh a debate. It's not just about explaining that I have more than the other person or I have less than the other person. It's also about explaining what we're actually using to weigh things with. Now, I just gave the first example, actors. We often care more about some individuals than others, right? In a debate on drug policy, we can argue that we care more about those already addicted than those that are not yet, right? We have innate moral judgment on addicts that we don't have for those not yet addicted. We have innate moral judgment on prisoners than we do over children, right? The most famous one is think of the children, and it works because people love it. Now, this can be tempting to be overused sometimes, especially if you don't know how to read your audience. A little inside secret for those like still new to debating. A lot of people think that, when I go to university, my people who are looking at me, people who are listening to me will be relatively left-wing. So I'll make most of my arguments about how minorities are impacted by this, or the people that are already vulnerable, the poor. But if you're in a different situation, let's say you're speaking to a Christian congregation in a church, if you argue about how Christians are going to be hurt by something, they'll maybe care more about that than other people. Being able to read your audience or already knowing up front what people they care about is going to make you much better at using this specific metric. Really wish I had a clicker. All right, severity, the scale of the impact. I don't think this needs much more explaining. It's as simple as how heavily are people impacted. What does play a role is that it's sometimes really hard to comprehend extreme impacts. This is a little bit grim, but one of the examples to use is, what does death mean for people, right? If we're talking, for example, about a debate about how many people are going to be impacted by coronavirus restrictions, right? Oh, the bars aren't open, thousands and thousands and thousands of young people can't go drinking, impact. But because we've closed them, there's going to be a lot less deaths. You're now comparing something that is very easy for people to grasp, the pleasure of a night out drinking, to something that is more intangible, like death. Even though you might say, okay, that should be very easy for people to understand, it's very distant from most Western people's lives to the degree that it can sometimes have less impact than you think. Oh, we all gotta die someday. Oh, you don't know what's gonna happen, etc., etc. So thinking about whether the things you're describing are easy for people to comprehend and feel is important. Another example is if your audience are school children or if they're students, they will understand like impacts like a teacher that's mean or a teacher that sexually harasses its students much more than they can understand the impact of your kids being in danger, right? They have innate connection stronger to certain metrics than they do to others. By the way, do you know what time is it? Because that one is not running correctly. All right, cool. Magnitude. The amount of people affected by something, right? Easy to compare. But again, it becomes difficult when you step outside of a human circle. Millions will be hurt by this. Thousands, billions, whatever. When people tend to argue like this, not only does it come across as hyperbole, it can also give people a sense of like incomprehensibility, right? Oh, the entire world will be affected by climate change. Very big, hard to comprehend. John down the street won't be able to afford gas. Easier to comprehend, right? Most people have had problems not being able to afford things. Most people don't have a training in climate science enough to like understand what that really means. This example is also a good one. The military as a global war would kill more people than would be safe when investing into museums. Domestically, it's difficult to understand the difference. Urgency. This one can start to feel a little bit like a fallacy, but it can actually be a strong one. So sooner impacts. Impacts that will occur sooner are valued higher as there is less time to deal with, right? So in this case, we should promote gas cars as they can be cheaper now and can help alleviate poverty today instead of electric cars. You guys probably all understand this because we all argue like this to ourselves, right? Oh, my friend needs help now. I'm going to go help him rather than study for the exam. Oh, I'm young now. There's a party tonight. I should do that rather than like get a higher grade for a paper that realistically I won't see a result from for now or even a little bit later. Long-term impacts are harder to comprehend. Impact length. Right? Does the impact affect the short-term or the long-term? People tend to be more okay with short-term impacts than long-term ones if they understand that both of them are really bad. No, I don't think that needs much more explanation. Is the impact realistically going to happen? This is where the strength of your argument comes in. I just said like you can do the weighing about, okay, it might happen, it probably will happen. We don't have a pen for this. But imagine that the likelihood of your argument can be expressed as a percentage, right? So there's a group of judges sitting there. I give an argument, what's called argument A. And after the end of me talking and my opponent talking, they believe there's 80% chance that the argument will actually occur, right? 80%. So that's pretty good. Now I give an impact that's worth about 1,000, right? By whatever metric you choose. 80% times 1,000, pretty bad. But let's say my opponent gives an argument that they believe 10% might happen, right? It probably won't, but if it did, he's convinced them that there's going to be an apocalyptic war scenario. Very good. You got to think often a little bit about, do I want to present likely arguments that don't have a big impact, or really unlikely arguments that could be really bad? Now you can give, this is a good example, it's a little bit more simplistic, but nuclear war is often given as a good example of this, right? If Russia steps into Ukraine, we want to defend Ukraine because not doing so would be bad, right? Likely to happen, a lot of damage if it does happen. But if we defend ourselves against the Russians and we get too involved with it, there might be a nuclear war. Very bad. Unlikely to happen, maybe to some people. But you start to understand how likelihood and impact really play into each other. Reversibility. I think this makes fairly a lot of sense, but a lot of people can forget about it, right? We need something now, not that bad, but if you do something that is irreversible, there is going to be a lot stronger impact. Civil liberties is a great example. I also like to think of things like when we talk about nuclear energy, a lot of people really, really worry about meltdowns and accidents like Chernobyl because they believe, oh, that kind of stuff is irreversible. So if it goes wrong, not only will it be really bad, but it will be bad forever. I don't know how many of you watched that TV series, but it didn't make an impact. Even if. It can be tempting to not want to give your opponent any impact because it might legitimize their argument, right? I don't even want to admit that what you're talking about might happen and then address your impact because it might make your arguments seem stronger, right? If you choose hard rebuttal, so just saying it won't ever happen, it implies you're super confident, it won't exist, etc., etc. If you say even if, well, then you might say that it might maybe happen, right? So it's up to you as a debater or speaker in a different case to make that seem like you're just doing your opponent a favor, right? A good way to do that is go, well, my opponent has argued that people, like if we legalize marijuana, there'll be more people driving across the streets. I've given you a lot of reasons why that won't happen, this and this and this, but let's humor him, right? I don't think it's true, but even if it's true, you go into the impact. That's how most debaters do it. Getting good at that is a great way to not only present yourself as a reasonable person in an argument, but to allow yourself to have it both ways. Spending more time on trying to hard rebuttal your opponent doesn't always add a lot of utility. Doing both hard rebuttal, attacking their argument, whether it even will happen, and even if it happens, very small, is the best way to do it. Getting good at it is the test of your debating skills. Framing. Lisa, would you say you've done this in some of your debates? Framing? Or is this the first time you're framing?
Well, obviously we do it online. We even do it when we talk to people.
Exactly. Well done. So, the lens through which an audience observes a debate. The choice we use in our language how to phrase arguments and impacts, right? This is as simple as what you see most politicians spending a lot of time on. You can call it grandstanding, you can call it like trying to like finagle debate, because you step away from facts, from logic. You step a little bit into just trying to make your opponent sound as bad as possible. Sometimes this can get really fun when you can like obviously perceive it. Sometimes it's a bit more subtle and it gets a little bit insidious. A good example of this one is freedom versus security, rights versus security, constitution versus feelings, right? With the gun debate in America, we see that a lot. Well, I know a lot of people are hurt and a lot of them are really worried and they're scared of guns, but the Constitution says this. Right? You didn't really say anything about the arguments of people that are against guns. You're just trying to make them sound less important, less relevant. You're trying to make them less believable in everything they say. In this case, sorry, one second. How to explain this best? I think the best way to talk about this is if you imagine yourself giving a speech at the beginning of your argument. So this little story you tell, you probably see people do this at a debate a lot. At the beginning of an argument, they'll go like, in our society, we see this and this and this. They do that before they even get into their arguments. They say, in our society, we still see hundreds locked away every year on like crazy marijuana laws that don't help anybody. These people are locked away. And they go into great detail about the prison system, et cetera, et cetera. That's based on impact as soon as they start connecting it to their arguments, but they're also framing the debate already at the start. They're putting themselves forward as someone who's protecting the rights of the imprisoned, protecting the right of the people to do whatever they want, and often putting their opponent in a different light as well. A good example of this as well from my field is whether you call rebels, terrorists, insurgents, freedom fighters. All those words really matter. If you ever sit down and write a speech for a longer time, or if you're writing an essay, for example, using argumentation, you usually can tell for yourself that you start like adapting little words every second. That's just because of how important it really is to people's mindset. Right. In a debate, framing is crucial because it decides the type of contest the debate is going to be. It also is about benchmarking, exactly. So, how to best explain that? I think the example is good. Any debate where I defend the police and you're defending criminals will tend to weigh towards my side, especially if you defend murderers, you defend rapists, etc., all that matters. So the wording you use is important, but it can also be about the bigger skill of the entire thing. So if you start at the beginning right away by saying like, this debate is about whether my security weighs up to your right to privacy, something like that. You've immediately set the tone of the debate, and all arguments will now be seen within that framework, essentially. Burdens. Burden, something you have to prove, or your opponent has to prove in order to win the debate. If my opponent cannot prove that legal marijuana will not cause more car accidents, he has already lost this debate. You're directly stating what you think he or she should prove in order to win the debate. This one is a favorite of some universities in the Netherlands when it comes to debating, specifically because they get taught it as a trick to trick your opponent into fighting a debate that he really shouldn't be doing at all. Right? So, for example, in this case, I've said that they have to prove that they won't cause more car accidents or they've already lost the debate. That isn't true at all, and presumably you know it when you say it, right? Like even if there will be more car accidents. There might be a lot of reasons to still legalize marijuana. But because you say it, you try to convince the members listening to you that that is the truth. If you can trick your opponent, wonderful. That's not always true. But usually it's easier to trick members of the audience, especially if you're using a burden that seems very convincing to them. That connects to the idea of not proven versus disproven, because you can also push them in a corner of something that can't be proven at all. So if my opponent cannot prove where he was on the night of he clearly committed this murder. That's not true at all. Maybe he was somewhere else. Maybe his alibi doesn't hold up. That doesn't prove he murdered someone at all. But people have been convicted on less. So trying to, at right at the beginning of the debate, to shift the burden onto them to claim I don't have to prove anything. Good example of this, right? If you're having a debate in your relationship about whether you cheated or not. I'm going to use that example. Sorry. When is the burden on you to prove that you haven't cheated, or can you claim, unless you can prove that I have, you should be trusting me in a relationship. You should be trusting that I haven't done anything. So by having a debate about the burdens, you've shifted who needs to be taking action. You've shifted who needs to be providing better argumentation. And as a consequence, you've already pushed the debate more towards your side. I wouldn't recommend that. I don't think it works out for people to start having that kind of debate. But it is true that stating the burden of opponent in the debate is similar to stating how a team has to prove their claim in an argument for it to be true. So as a claim in an argument is a central idea, so to an entire debate can a burden be something that is fundamentally underpinning it. In a debate, we often have limited time. So if you can make the debate about something your opponent doesn't want to talk about at all, you're also just using up their time, right? Either they have to ignore you, usually not a good idea, or they have to spend a lot of time talking about something they don't want to talk about at all. Making the other side prove the feasibility of their policy, the morality of their ideas, right? This is a good example. Debating about the death penalty, the negative side of the debate could state that for the affirmative side to win, they need to show how the death penalty creates more justice in the world. I've just made this debate about justice when it couldn't have been about a lot of other things. The incredible cost of prosecuting someone who might be convicted of the death penalty, the irreversibility of the death penalty, right? People get found innocent years later. Oh, damn, we already murdered him. A lot of problems with it. But if you can make the debate about justice, then it's going to be about that. The trick really is that you need to prove how the burden is the key point of the debate. So you need to have arguments as to why something is the crux of the matter. So in this case, you can just say that, okay, the debate about the death penalty is about justice, but you have to prove that to a degree. So you can also spend time on trying to prove why a burden is central. You can go into, well, when we're talking about the death penalty, it's a judicial penalty handed out by our justice system. And our justice system is fundamentally focused on providing the most justice to the most people. That's its purpose in our society. That's why it was created, et cetera, et cetera. And then your opponent, rather than anything that has to do with arguments, might spend a lot of time focusing on, okay, no, our justice system is made to provide the most happiness for the most people, or to give us the feeling that we live in a just society, or our justice system is designed to be cost effective. Like, I've heard a lot of interesting arguments over the years, but this is where debates can get complicated for people who don't realize this. They think, and I'm not really sure how to pen, but they think that a debate is about, okay, one argument, second argument, third argument, opponent, one argument, second argument, third argument. And then as soon as their opponent starts talking about a burden, they're confused because that wasn't an argument and it didn't have the structure that it used to. And why is he or she doing this? As soon as you can understand that they're trying to shift a burden onto you that you do not want, you can start addressing it directly and debating against it and hopefully winning your debate. Oh, I like the self-driving cars example because it's a great moment of realization that a lot of people have, but I want to see if you guys can understand why. So when I say that self-driving cars still have accidents, and my opponent needs to prove how self-driving cars are perfect and never have accidents in order for him to win the debate as to why they should be legal on the road. What burden am I shifting, and why is it entirely fair? I'll be there. So we're having a debate about whether self-driving cars should be allowed on the road, fully autonomous cars. And my opponent is given a lot of great arguments, and I say, no, my opponent's burden in this debate is to prove that self-driving cars are 100% safe and never have any accidents. If you can't do that, then they shouldn't be allowed on the road. Yeah?
That's not true. They don't have to be perfect.
Why
They
not?
have to be as good as humans or better, but not perfect.
Exactly. So the flaw is that you can start arguing exactly like on that side. Someone might fall into, oh no, they have like this is this, and they'll get better, and they'll start improving, and then one day they'll be perfect, and then we'll allow them on the road, right? You've lost that debate because you haven't realized what your burden was. It wasn't proving that they were perfect. It was proving that they were better than humans. These are kind of examples of moments where people have lost debates because they're so in the argument that they start responding to what their opponent has claimed they should prove rather than looking out for what am I actually debating. Good idea. Right, fallacies. Let me check real quick. Oh, okay. Can anyone name any fallacies off the top of their head? Yeah, I know John can. I need help making this, but yes, sir. Sir? Slippery slope.
No
Yeah.
true Scotsman, a bunch of them.
No true Scotsman. All right. Anybody else?
Scapegoat.
What do you mean by scapegoat exactly?
Well, in a sense, blaming something on someone or putting all the blame on something in a debate usually where blame shouldn't be allocated to, where you can say partly responsible, but really it should be going there as well.
That's bad logic. Like I mean, as an argument. But why do you think it's an example of a fallacy?
Well, because at the end of the day, if you start scapegoating certain things, it's quite dangerous the moment that people can prove your scapegoat is not responsible, right? Or not completely responsible, so the majority of the responsibility is somewhere else. And if you've already picked that as a scapegoat, then you kind of stand there looking a bit stupid.
I mean, that's fair. But when we're talking about a fallacy, I'll get into that in a second. That one isn't very common because a fallacy is usually about something else. We'll get into that. Yeah. Any other fallacies?
I mean, I started debating 5 months ago. I don't know more than a slippery slope.
And that's okay, but fallacies are usually something that people bring up in regular debates, right? I mean, as in when people just yell at each other, they often like even pull in fallacies just to sound smart. Louisa, Bianca, any ideas? Common fallacies? No, you have more?
Isn't anecdotal evidence a fallacy too?
Yeah, definitely.
So there is also the dichotomy of truth and false.
Can you explain that one?
So you frame that it's either 100% truth or 100% false, and there is nothing in between. So either completely right or completely wrong.
Binary choice, exactly. Yeah. Anything else?
Uh,
No, it's okay.
yeah,
It's okay. You've done a lot, and we have some examples that I want people to guess anyway. So let's have a look. Yeah, is a failure in reasoning which renders an argument invalid. Now, obviously, I need to adapt that a little bit to be the argument might still be true, but the fallacy itself doesn't prove it, right? So if I say, I don't know, self-driving cars are safer sometimes than humans because my friend Bob says so. That's not a good logic, but the argument itself might still be true. Just I haven't proven it. They can be highly persuasive, right? This is, again, what we said about most people using these a lot in argumentation. You can usually kind of feel they're wrong, but not when you're in the moment itself. The amount of conversations you'll have in which people bring up fallacies commonly, and you'll look like a, let's say, dick, if you bring up like, oh, that's this fallacy, is common. That doesn't mean you're wrong, but this is so common in people's brains when they talk about logic or they try and argue that it's very hard to see through it. Okay, first example. Louisa, can you read it out? Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll do it. Experimenting on animals reduces our respect for the sanctity of all life. If we do not respect life, we are likely to become more and more tolerant of violent acts like war and murder. Soon, our society will become a battlefield in which everyone constantly fears for their lives. It'll be the end of civilization. To prevent this horrible fate from dooming us all, experimenting on animals should be outlawed in this instance.
Well, that's clear statement.
Exactly. All right. So this is crucial because I like this one the most. Why is it a slippery slope? What is the problem with the reasoning?
Well, they start with if we do this, end of the world.
Exactly. Well, what is the flaw from going from that to that?
Is the stuff not explained?
Yes, exactly. We'll get into that in a second, but a lot of people, when they hear an argument about, okay, this thing will lead to this, so a chain reaction or something like that, they'll instantly call a slippery slope. That isn't necessarily true. It's about whether the steps in between are explained. Here we go. A claim that a chain reaction ending in dire consequences will take place without enough evidence. It becomes a slippery slope if there's not enough evidence for every step down the track. So in this case, experimentation on animals is the original thing that they have a problem with. This is the final consequence, the end of civilization. And they do mention the steps in between, right? Less respect for all life, increased violence. So while they're mentioned, what is the problem? They're not explained. You don't give a reason, and this is the beautiful transition that me and Jonah were discussing earlier. You don't give a reason why one will lead to the next, will lead to the next, will lead to the next. Now, sometimes in a slippery slope, right, people will call a slippery slope when the thing itself actually makes sense. A chain reaction can occur, and you can give good argumentation why it does, right? For example, when we talk about a civil rights debate, if we allow the government to spy on us here, people will become more familiar with invasions of their privacy. As they become more familiar with invasion with their privacy, they'll stop protesting the thing the government has just passed. And when the next thing is introduced, something that would previously be unthinkable to most people as an incredible invasion of privacy, now seems more reasonable to them because they're already used to having their privacy invaded. For example, debates about cameras, right? Most people nowadays, let's put up cameras in the bathrooms to make sure people aren't doing drugs there, right? If you propose that out of the blue, probably most people wouldn't be in favor of it. But first, we put up cameras in the classrooms. Then we put them up in the hallways. Then we put a person in the bathroom just to make sure that they aren't looking at us taking drugs. There's a person there, we might as well have a camera there. Now, that was just very quickly done on the top of my head, but you make steps and you give argumentation why they will come in between, not necessarily a slippery slope. It's a slippery slope if I just yell, if they start putting up cameras in the hallway, next thing they'll put the cameras in the bathroom. Do you really want that? Then it's a slippery slope.
It's basically frog and boiling water.
Yes, exactly. The argument I just gave you. Yeah, exactly. Right. The second one is more, let's say, real life. It's very common. And now you'll see why this is actually kind of insidious, because it works on people that really, really don't like the first thing you're proposing, right? If they already hate it, then they don't need a lot of arguments how it'll get worse. They need those to justify something to themselves. Now, that's slightly political, but it doesn't just apply to conservatives and gay marriage, it applies to anything, right? So this is a vegan argument about experimentation on animals and how it's eventually going to doom us all. If people really don't like the first thing, they're really eager to explain why it will end in the last thing, even if they can't really prove that. So in this case, gay marriage will lead to men marrying goats, that's Rick Santorum. And why? Well, the definition of marriage will become meaningless and humans will marry anything. Now, those are the steps that are problematic, right? You need to explain why one will lead to the next one, why that one will lead to humans will marry anything, and then why that will lead to men marrying goats. So if you were going to rebuttal this argument, where would you start?
Well, I mean, obviously you can attack the red hours, but you can also attack the fact, but you can also start even earlier on. So you can say, right, we don't have gay marriage, right? That's obvious, but at the same time, we do have marriage that has evolved already. So we were going from, for example, marriage is a thing where you decide on the partner you will have sex with for the rest of your life, to, well, you can fuck whoever you want, and then you kind of have like a state thing, and then you kind of like get engaged to somebody, and then you marry them, but you can fuck people on the side, and you can fuck people as well. So honestly, marriage doesn't really matter, like, I don't know, anyways. So the traditional model is already crap. So like we're already in that process. So you can start from the beginning, but I'm sure you can also start.
So your point here was your idea of what it was like. The gay marriage will make definition of marriage meaningless because it already is.
No, sorry, my simple start is like the thing what I want to attack is that basically this whole thing has already started.
Right.
Marriage has already been starting to become meaningless. Yeah.
But Okay, but you're close to a good argument, but like, okay, so why does the definition of marriage having become meaningless already mean that gay marriage isn't a bad thing? Because it won't make things worse than they already are? Or are you trying to say that marriage becoming meaningless hasn't proven to be a bad thing?
Right, exactly. Now I get the point. Well, yeah, that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to explain how marriage is already meaningless, so we skip the gay marriage part. So we're already down that slippery road, and if we go one step back, that won't change.
Right. Okay. So it's very interesting. Actually, I really like that. So to a degree, that would work, right? Okay. So we're already here, and going back a step won't matter. Like we aren't able to, but they could still say that gay marriage would make it even more meaningless. Perhaps a better way to go into your debate would be to say, okay, it's already become meaningless, and we don't see that humans are marrying anything yet. We don't see that society has collapsed, anything like that. I actually like you going into that because it's an interesting debate to have in that context. But also remember to talk about impact, right? Because I have heard someone once attack this entire argument by talking about why men marrying goats wouldn't be bad, as long as the goats give consent, right? So you can really like think a little bit out of the box, because sometimes when people make slippery slopes, like, and then next thing you know, like women will be marrying each other as well, and then you can go, all right, that's not necessarily bad, and then you can focus on that. Go ahead, sorry.
Well, the problem is that with saying like gay marriage, we don't see society collapsing. Someone might say that marriage has been a thing for like 3,000 years, and gay people have been married for past 20 or 30. So it's just too short time frame to observe collapse of the society.
And now you're thinking like a true debater, because now you're reinforcing the slippery slope by essentially going, no, it's happening. It's just happening very slow.
To say that definition of marriage became meaningless, someone must say, okay, so gay marriage is just another step. So it started becoming meaningless, and we just switch them.
Right. Now, that's a very good way to repair it. But I wanted to demonstrate this because a slippery slope is the most common fallacy, exactly exemplified by all of you being able to name it. But understanding really how to repair it or how to make a good argument that uses a slippery slope is important. Go ahead.
I just want to make the point, you could also just say marriage being destroyed is a good thing.
Yeah.
Marriage is useless.
And now you're really thinking outside the box. I like it. Yeah. But that's exactly like where you should be thinking if you're thinking about attacking impacts, right? This is about logic, so more on the side of hard rebuttal. But if you're trying to think about impacts, then you can make this whole thing meaningless by arguing that marriage being destroyed isn't a bad thing. All right, second example. You were first. All right, first to state out a fallacy when you see it, that's the point.
False
You have one.
authority.
What's that?
False authority.
Yes, 1 point for you.
I had no chance.
No, I know. The next one will be fair. Yeah, well, Guy Hansen may be an authority on being a handsome actor. There is no particular reason why anybody should be removed by his political opinion. So, appeal to false authority. Sorry, what?
I don't know names in English. Can I just throw them in Latin?
Yeah. We'll get to the ones that have Latin with it. Don't worry. I have all these Latin like jokes in there. Anyway. Bianca and Louisa, I can't believe you. I will call your mom. Okay, let's go. Yeah, these things happen, all right? Remember that time that Bianca, like, whatever, it's fine. Nothing. All right. We can add strength to our argument by referring to respectful sources. I think person referring to respected sources, right? So sometimes it can be like, President, I don't know, Obama said this in 2016. President, scientist Anthony Fauci said this, right? If we try to get the audience to agree simply by addressing with a name who actually isn't an authority, then it shouldn't be evidence in our favor, right? So Guy Hansen obviously wasn't. But the mistake that a lot of people make is that even if a person is an authority on the topic, they might still be wrong. So while it is more easy to recognize an appeal to authority as a fallacy if it's Guy Hansen speaking on something that he doesn't know shit about, it is sometimes difficult to recognize whether an authority might still be wrong on something, especially if you're talking about a topic where you have a lot of experts on both sides who disagree with each other, or if you're having a vaccines cause autism debate, then you might have 2 or 3 doctors saying something about how vaccines cause autism. If you argue with them on their side, it might seem like a strong argument until you go, okay, but how many other people disagree, or what did the studies actually say? So keep it in mind, it's not just when Guy Hansen speaks on stuff he doesn't know about, it can also be when you appeal to an authority that might still be wrong. Yes.
Isn't it easy to appeal authority about a department? Let's take code, for example, instead of deciding to do RVM.
Yeah, but see, that can work, and it is good, but there's a lot of reasons why an authority might still not be like truthful, right? And sometimes their logic can be completely flawed. A good example of the department in this case would be the EPA. In American history, they've made a lot of mistakes. They've been corrupted, bribed, they've said things that make no sense whatsoever. So even though an authority can be powerful, and in a simplified situation, and sometimes it's heuristic, it can really appeal, it's always good to keep in mind that strength of evidence and data should usually sway a debate, not name dropping, and it can be useful to point that out if your opponent is using like a department as an ultimate authority, right? So like the RVM says this, okay, sure, but the RVM has said this and then come back on it later. They've said this in March when that was bullshit. So maybe they're wrong now too. You've demolished the authority, and it wasn't difficult because most people make mistakes sometimes. Using logic and data can be your best bet, right? Our best political experts think that Hillary Clinton will definitely win the presidency, so she will. Authority doesn't mean truth, neither does it not, but it can have a lot of flaws. Okay, you guys ready? Fingers on the buzzers? Yes, point for you. What does that mean?
Appeal to popularity. If something is popular, it must be true.
I love that you use popular rather than appeal to the people. A popular really is appeal to the people, but I like the popular argument. I like it much more. So and that's of course where the word comes from. So 70% of Americans think so. 70% of Americans might be wrong, right? That is not unusual on different topics. Now this is a moral argument, so it's a bit more iffy, but because moral arguments are more philosophical anyway. But you could also say something like 80% of Americans don't believe in climate change, or 20% of Americans believe that the Earth is flat. Percentages can be convincing if we're talking about where all of us want to go to dinner, because that's more of a mutual choice that we agree can be decided most of the time by democracy. When we're talking about is what is true or what isn't true, popular vote tends not to matter much. And what that says about democracy, I'll leave up to you, because we tend to decide things this way a lot. But at least as a logical argument, it tends to be flawed. Now, again, we see here how the fallacy rubs up against a lot of the things we do every day. Which path is the best to take? Well, what does most people think? It's A, and let's do A. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, sorry, is there a problem?
Yeah, Jonah, we'll talk to you about it. The alarm got tripped. That's not
Okay, it's up and alarm. It's push on the other
Yes.
side. No, not back so, but so. Okay.
I think we figured it out now.
Thank you.
And then give you another example of when ad hominem arguments are used a lot. Yes.
Well, pineapple should not be on pizza.
Yeah, that's a good one. But okay. Can I give you another example?
So in Poland, vast majority, like 90%, affiliates as Christians.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, politicians are inclined to say that since almost everyone is Christian, we should do everything in Christian ways.
Yeah, and again, that's very difficult because 90% of people are Christian, means their interests are being represented, and in the democracy, that would mean that what they say should go.
They are not; they just affiliate as
No.
Christians from the culture.
Yeah, but no, but like so in a democracy, we do make a lot of decisions by what most people think. That is usually more about what people prefer rather than what people think is true. The line between that is difficult, though. If 80% of people don't believe that climate change is true, then they're not going to prefer to do anything about it, and you're going to get into trouble. That's why it's so important to convince people. Yes, a populum translates to the people in Latin. Anybody who didn't get that as soon as they saw that should be ashamed if you went to a Latin-speaking high school, like gymnasium in the Netherlands, but it's okay because I had to look a lot of these up as well. Oh yeah, and of course, obviously you're taking advantage of the desire for people to fit in with most people. Go ahead.
Ad hominem.
Yes, which means?
To the person, to the human.
Yeah, to the person is fine. So, the Dorcas parameter, which the speaker has characterized in such detail, has nothing to do with her arguments. You're checking your opponent instead of the opponent's argument. Now, again, this is one that most people usually guess. You guys didn't mention it first, which I think is interesting. It's either a good sign that you guys haven't been attacked on your personal lot, or you just forgot about it. But it is actually incredibly often used, right? Most arguments have some kind of like if you're having an actual fight, they tend to devolve into ad hominems very quickly, right? Oh, should we go to this restaurant or this restaurant? If you're discussing it with your partner, a lot of it becomes about, well, you made this wrong choice and you didn't take out the garbage. You start attacking any kind of aspect of the person rather than addressing their argument, which is, we should go to this restaurant because it is better than the one you chose. Now, even in like a very professional level, think political debates, Trump versus Clinton, Trump versus Biden, really Trump versus anybody. But even in Dutch debates, there are a lot of ad hominem attacks, especially by right-wing politicians sometimes against the main leader, because they are very tempting and they work. Yeah.
But in political debates specifically,
Yeah.
Is it still completely a fallacy? Because at the end of the day, particularly when say you look at Clinton versus Trump, at the end of the day, you're electing a person. So attacking that person's quality is not necessarily off topic if I say I don't want a person with certain qualities in an office of power.
See, now this is a very good point, but it's because you're essentially, in most political debates that are televised, you're having two debates at once. You're having the actual debate that you've just announced, instead of, for example, now we're discussing immigration. Why do you think we should keep immigrants out? Why do you think we should be in? Then that's what we're discussing, and that's an argument. The ad hominem attacks are about the larger debate of who is better to lead the country. So yes, theoretically you're right. Like a lot of those arguments would be fair. Like, okay, you cheat on your taxes, you're weak, you won't stand up to Putin. Those are great arguments in the line of discussion or line of debate about who is qualified to run this country. But then they should be used in that context. If they start being used in context of arguments, it becomes confusing. People start associating one with the other, right? You're weak, you can't do this, you can't do this, and your point makes no sense. Theoretically, you're right. The ad hominem attacks are fair in the other debate that's happening at the same time, but they shouldn't be mixed, and they often are. So when you see ad hominem attacks happening, and someone says, which is on why you're unfit to be president, probably really fair. Ad hominem attacks are happening, which is why people shouldn't believe your argument about immigration, not fair. Right. I think everyone gets this. Oh, well, I mean, obviously the reason this is faulty logic is because their argument stands loose from who they are as a person, right? Which can be really difficult to see, but even a broken clock is wrong twice a day. If you want a Trump example, his complaints about NATO defense spending, even though he has a lot of flaws, that doesn't mean the argument is totally wrong. That's it. Yeah, now I'm expecting a Latin name, of course.
Yeah, trying to.
And you're also doing it in English if you know. Are you Keulen?
No.
Okay. Okay. So you're independent but not cheating. All right. Oh, nobody? Oh,
I'll
wow.
explain it, but I don't have a name for it.
Okay, well, what is it?
It's basically a recall to the nostalgia, like the past.
No, that's wrong, actually. That's something people do, and it's a fallacy that I don't even know if we have it at the end, but
The problem is if someone did something wrong before, they cannot be right about that thing now after some time has passed.
exactly. The Latin word for it is tu quoque. The fact that kids' parents have themselves done a bad thing has no bearing on the strength of their argument against it, right? The argument stands on its own. So if I've previously cheated, and then I say, you really shouldn't cheat, someone can go like, well, you did it. Yeah, that's why I know it's a terrible idea. Those are the kind of things that sometimes work, sometimes they don't. And tu quoque arguments are incredibly convincing when it comes to why people feel they don't have to listen to someone else. And this is, again, one of those where I point out that it's incredibly strong and we use it every day, even though you know it doesn't work. Even if you spot it and you name it and you see it, it's still really hard not to be convinced by it, right? Someone who's committed fraud themselves, who's speaking against fraud, it doesn't work. They sound unbelievable, right? If I am someone who's really prone to smoking and to I don't know, driving on the wrong side of the road, and I see someone drinking too much, and I'm like, you really shouldn't do that. It's bad for you. Yes, it's bad for you, but who's going to listen to me? So in that case, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Unless you've gone to jail for it, and then they make a movie about you, start some popular actor, and then you make life as coach.
Exactly, but like the thing is that the tu quoque argument is faulty because you got to understand why, but it is very difficult to get around, right? Boris Johnson, for example, arguing that it's irresponsible to have parties during a pandemic. True, definitely true, but the argument is a lot less persuasive than it was a few months ago. So hypocrisy is the strong like point here, right? Okay, y'all ready? Yeah.
I want to say the end of 2015, but that's not correct.
No, nobody? This is the straw man fallacy.
Oh,
Yeah. So the anti-pornography argument is being made weak by being overstated. Now, we do this in every argument we have, right? Hyperbole is a big, strong thing. You saw me doing when I was framing earlier. That's me using fallacies to be framing something, right? But fundamentally, knocking down a straw man is not impressive. The reason it's called a straw man is because you make him yourself, right? You stuff him full of straw, you give him clothing, and you painted your opponent's name on it, but you're not actually attacking your opponent, you're hitting a straw man, which is way easier, right? Now, if you're doing this as a game or as a sport, debating being a sport after all, that's, okay, you're now playing an easier game and you're not having as much fun doing it, I can promise you that, but you're also learning less because being a straw man is not effective, it can't hit you back, and you're not training for the real thing, right? This is why when people are debating in front of people, or speaking on a topic in front of a room that agrees with them, they often find themselves being less nervous because whatever they say, as long as it's in agreement with the room will go, yeah, amazing, right? If I'm speaking to a church about how, I don't know, how Christians are the most moral people on the earth, they're likely to start applauding me because they agree with me anyway. And then when I start speaking against incredibly strawman versions of our opponents, they're likely to follow with me. But if I want to do a good job actually defeating my opponent's argument, I have to attack who they really are. I have to attack what their arguments really are, and I have to use their logic. Taking you don't have to take their best case, although that's a brave thing to do. Taking them at their normal stance is the best way of doing it. It's a bold version to do. It's honest and ultimately more effective. Can anyone give me an example of a straw man fallacy that you see regularly? Now that you know what it is.
yeah. Radical left is trying to destroy foundation of our society.
Yeah, that's a really good one, right? They are trying to do some things. That's probably not it. And by making it more extreme, you appeal to people's sense of like, okay, that we definitely should stop. So you're trying to defeat what they're doing by making it more extreme. Now, this is very common in debating as well, because with all the framing we're doing, with all the argumentation we're doing, there tends to be a tendency to want to sort of like make our opponent's arguments easier to dismiss, right? That's fair when we're doing the weighing. You can actually weigh in your favor a little bit. Try not to do it when attacking their analysis. Let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. So if you see your opponent arguing that, I'm going to go back to the marijuana one, I guess, that the taxes on marijuana, once it becomes legal, will bring in millions and millions of revenues, right? It's easy to start going, okay, like some of the money that will be brought in by the paltry, like marijuana trade, won't really make much of a difference. You're referring to their impact there, but that's not what they said. And if the judge has been paying attention, they'll probably know it. Or so if you want to take a stronger version and you go, there might be some income, there is a big marijuana trade, there probably will be some millions made from it, but I'm going to show you why there's still way more harms than benefits and why this won't go as well as possible. Again, you're also looking to more reasonable. If people can spot your straw man, you start, like the way you pointed it out before, you start to seem a bit weird. They'll look at you giving your speech and they'll start dismissing the things you're saying because they're going in their heads like, no, that's not what they said. I've heard what the opponent said. So again, straw man fallacy, very tempting if you're speaking to people who already agree with you. Better thing to do if you want to become better at a debater and be more effective, especially when speaking against people that might be in the middle, is to attack an honest version of your opponent's arguments. Framing is important, impacts are important, weighing is important, but trying to address openly and honestly the argument first, then doing all of that is a better method. Okay. This one is a politically correct version of the real world.
So is it just for the economy? Like
Yes.
thinking?
Exactly, the one you mentioned. Now, this is Caldwell Hall, of course, it's in bad shape. Either we should tear it down, or we continue to risk our students' safety. Problem is that, as you said, those aren't the only two options, right? You might be able to repair it, et cetera, et cetera. This is more common as well when you put urgency on a decision. It's very tempting when people believe that issues are black and white when they're often not. Can I give you another example of when, like, especially in politics, arguments are made about things being black and white when there's other options available?
Immigration.
Yeah, you can either let in nobody or we can let everybody in through the border. It's also an example of a strawman fallacy because they often go like, oh, the Democrats want to be letting everybody in through the, like, et cetera, et cetera. So they're both making it black and white. We can do that and let nobody in, but they're also exaggerating their opponent's position because they're actually more in the middle, right? So that's a really good example. I have a few more. There's obviously more than the ones I can mention here. But some of these that are fairly common, hasty generalization, right? Like, okay, this group like does this, everybody in this group does this. Very common. Missing the point. I like that one. The premises of an argument does not support a particular conclusion, but not the speaker's one, right? So, I can get a good an example prepared for this one. But let me think about that. I'll come up with one. But the other one, fallacy of observation. Oh, this is a fallacy of observation, actually. The current option being bad does not make it the alternative better. Maybe the current status quo option is already the best possible, right? So that's when people, for example, we give the coronavirus crisis as an example. Right now, our hospitals are being overwhelmed and our bars are being closed, et cetera, et cetera. This is really bad. We need to do something different. Like, it makes sense from a view of, well, things are bad, so obviously we should make changes. But that doesn't necessarily mean your alternative is better. If your next alternative is, so we should open everything up or we should close everything down, you have to prove why your alternative is actually better than how bad things already are. Otherwise known as, like, when people are sitting still and things are bad, they start to believe that everything that is going to be different might be better, but there is no reason why that has to be the case. Sometimes you only have bad options. Now, again, that is one that is used in politics very often. Right? Status quo is almost never satisfying to everybody. People are usually unhappy with what's happening right now, right? That's what status quo means. So if you can present a reason why your change might make things better, they're usually on board with it, even if there's also a large potential of you making things worse. False cause fallacy. Assuming that B comes after A, because B comes after A, that A causes B, right? Correlation, not causation, or not even correlation. Easy problems. Again, one that people fall for if it's quick, less likely to fall for it if they think about it. Weak analogy, two things being compared aren't alike in the context because the analogy is a weak one, right? It's actually also relatively similar to the gay marriage argument, like, well, if men start marrying men, then why won't they start marrying goats? Right? If you get that whole slippery slope, but what you're doing, if you just say those two things, you're making an analogy between the two when really they're really not able to be compared. Appeal to pity, the speed of trying to get people to accept the conclusion of making them feel sorry for someone. I like that one. Jonah actually introduced me to that one. It's very easy to understand that one, right? Like, oh, these poor group something is happening to, we really need to help them because, oh, look how poor they are, look how poor. It doesn't mean that whatever you're arguing for will work. It's just an argument about how sad they are. Red herring. I do this by accident, being ADHD and all that, but you go off on a side tangent, completely distracted from the conversation, and hoping to distract your audience from the actual flaws in your argument or what you were really arguing about. This is also been used in political debates a lot. You're arguing and your point is kind of weak, so you just start attacking your opponent, hoping that everybody who's listening will be focused on the attack, and then you come back around to your arguments. So yeah, that's why we should do this. And then people are so on your side about your attacks that they start believing what you were saying, even though you've not proven anything at all. Back in the question, you'll get lectures like this, or people online or people in essays who just go like, I'm just asking questions. And then they keep putting question marks at the end when they go like, so what is really happening? Is this the best way to take care of things? What if we could do it better by doing it a different way? And tell me why. Like, is there going to be something different? Do you have a different suggestion? By just asking questions about what is already happening, or constantly mentioning that things like there's questions to be asked is not an argument, right?
Doesn't that tie into the fact that if you ask a question, you just answer it?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. I think I've actually said that before when we done like other debating workshops on EDS. Like, this is also when impact becomes really important, right? So, like, okay, what does that mean about the damage that will be done by this event, right? Like you've proven that this might happen, and you go like, oh, the damage might be untold. That begs the question, what else is happening? Okay, you need to have an actual logical argument that ends in an impact. You can't just end on a question, leaving your audience to imagine everything horrible that might happen as a consequence of the argument. Equivocation, sliding between two or more different meanings of a word or phrase important to the argument, right? We do this with rights a lot, we do this with freedom a lot, we do this with immigration a lot. It can fall into the, sometimes into the, like the mutual dichotomy a lot, but in this case, it's usually just about that the meaning of a word, especially words that we often fall into semantics with, like the ones that you gave, like freedom or rights, does matter. Defining it at the beginning, then talking about it later on, better way to do this. All right, some examples.
Before you move on,
Oh,
the
go ahead.
last one, isn't that like just an issue that especially government spaces, like opening government?
Have they been explaining the BP structure debating or not?
Probably not really.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say that the people who propose a law and they're sliding between two different meanings of a word, they tend to be the ones that have to define what we're actually debating about. So let's say I give an example. There's a more philosophical mode. I go like, okay, the right of every citizen in our nation to the security and the right to life is more important than their right to privacy. If you're the one who proposes a statement like that, you're usually the one who's going to be setting up the meaning of the word privacy, the meaning of the word security, etc., etc. It can be really tempting to then slide around between, oh, freedom is important, and then they go into, yeah, but the freedom to like not be watched by a camera, really how important is that? When the opponent steps up, they might slide to the definition of freedom, where it's about, okay, we don't want to be in prison for the rest of our lives. Sliding between definitions is common in debate, it's kind of phrasing, but just completely switching in between your own arguments, that's when it's equivocation. Okay, example. This house would lower the required age to vote. These debates are very common when we do standard debates, because this is a relatively easy to understand motion that has a lot of interesting impacts and arguments. This house would lower the required to vote. So grounds data in this case, because the first thing we do is we present our claim. Lowering the voting age would make government policies better reflect the interests of the people that are impacted by those policies, microspace. So grounds data, climate change, greatest effects when we fell from 50 to 100 years from now. My warrant or my analysis, the impact of climate change policy will mostly be felt by young children. If they could vote, they'd vote for their interests. The impact of claim serving the interests of those mostly impacted by policies will strengthen our democracy, and that is a good thing. So our rebuttal in this case goes directly against the analysis. Children are easily swayed against their own interests, especially in favor of short-term versus long-term interests. What we're attacking here is this specific part. Who can tell me if this is short or soft or hard rebuttal?
It's hard.
Yeah, it is. We're trying to prove that a step in their analysis that they are going to vote for their own interests isn't true. Would you guys say I've completely proven that this won't happen?
No, not really.
Why not?
Because the fact that children are easily swayed against doesn't mean they will be. Or like there won't be just a bunch of children who will vote what they think anyways.
Right. So the first thing is like just because they won't be.
It's possible, it's not guaranteed to happen. I think that's a very logical fallacy.
Yeah. So you're saying that because some might still vote for their interests, the argument's impact has been reduced, but you haven't completely destroyed it.
Yeah.
Right. Fair enough. If I was going to attack the impact, what would that look like? So if I was going to do soft rebuttal on this argument.
You can, for example, say that.
Oh, sorry. Who is that? Sorry. You both raised your arms. You can speak as one person if you prefer.
I would argue that the younger ages that currently are allowed to vote have a very low turnout of voting. Thus, who would say that children actually show up to vote?
Right. So, this is interesting. Do you think you just rebuttal this argument? Or do you think you
It's
what's
a
that?
soft one.
What? Yeah, but okay, so let's go back a second. What is the impact of this argument? Like I've written it here, but what does that mean? Like serving the interests of those most impacted by policies will strengthen our democracy, right? I'm saying something about the nature of democracy, so that like it should reflect the interests of the people there, and that it becomes stronger when people see their own interests reflected. What was your argument about it?
My argument was they won't show up in the first place, so they won't see anything.
Right. So you are like having an impact, but you are attacking this part. You're saying if they could vote, they'd vote for their own interest. You're saying they won't do that at all. So you are attacking the impact, but you're not doing it by self-rebuttal, right? You're doing it through the mechanism hard rebuttal. You're saying this won't happen. So the crucial difference is that rather than attacking everything that's going to happen, you're attacking the heart of their analysis. So like you're doing it by analogy, right? You're saying like we already have young voters and they behave this way. And by doing what by giving essentially what you think is a hard rebuttal here, you're also similarly doing what you were already doing. You're shrinking the group of people that will actually be voting. And that way you are reducing the impact. You can do that explicitly. So you can go into like, okay, again, the same thing applies to you. Some children might vote for their own interest. A lot of them will be swayed by their own interest, or a lot of them won't actually show up, right? So what you're doing there is you're making the impact a lot smaller. Yeah, it does. I do think that when you're talking about this specific impact, there's a different argument that you make. Can anybody give me a different example of how you could attack specifically the impact directly? Yes.
I'm not sure how that works, but you could say that, well, young people are quite naive, so where they will probably vote for the party which declares most of their values, but just because the party says that they will present specific values or they will implement specific policy doesn't actually mean they will. So they don't really have the insight about how to tackle voting for a party. So at the end, you will see that they vote for a party which is very idealistic, but this party will actually not implement what they have promised, because their only goal is going to be to get into the government, and their voting base is going to be the young people. And with that, the children will see no results in their actual voting, which will then again weaken the voting, the democracy, because people will not really see why voting will represent their voice.
Yeah, that's really well done, especially if you did write it down. So first of all, good job. Actually, interesting because you're attacking exactly like this angle again. You're like they would vote for their own interests. You're attacking the connection between this. So essentially, an analysis, in my opinion, you're like that the government policies won't actually better reflect their interests. So just giving them the right to vote won't actually make policy reflect their interests. That's still a really good argument, and I think it does lower the analysis, but you're still kind of doing hard rebuttal, like arguing about why this necessarily won't strengthen democracy, right? Or why that isn't a good thing is more of a hard attack on impact. But you guys are now seeing the lines in between hard and self-rebuttal that's more advanced, essentially, where you start getting into, am I attacking whether it will be true completely, or am I attacking how much it will be true? That's why I think you guys are doing well. Yeah, go ahead.
The other one has kids are stupid and don't know what the interests are.
Yeah, so exactly, like that's kind of what the rebuttal already is, right? They're swayed against their own interests easily, but it is still a good point. Second example. This house believes that developing nations function best under a dictatorship. Very often heard. Jonah's very proud of himself. I see it. Yeah. Grounds data, right? Like first claim, dictators are able to enact policy better than other forms of government. Well, Singapore had been a dictatorship until 1990, was able to quickly develop. Now, there's already kind of a bit of a fallacy, right? Because that's an example. We can use it to illustrate, but it can like add a little bit weight to our argument, but it isn't necessarily like a study or anything. Warrant, dictators do not have to deal with as much bureaucracy in politics and implementing policy. Therefore, dictators will be able to better enact policy than other forms of government. Well, the answer to that, of course, would be due to more effective style of government, country will develop faster. Rebuttal, workers in a dictatorship don't have to be good at their job. They have to be politically loyal. This means less gets done. Right? In the Dutch government, you can be VVD, you can be CDA, you can be of any party, and you can still do your job as long as you're good at your job. If you're working in a dictatorship, it's more about whether you're politically loyal, otherwise you get fired. Yeah, I see you. We can give me a different example of how to rebut this argument. Both hard and soft is fine. Yes, go ahead.
So the impact is due to a quick, effective style of governance, the country develops much faster. And the underlying assumption is that a dictatorship is interested in the development of the country. Whereas, and that is quick and effective. Whereas what we actually see, or what often happens to be the case, the reason for a dictatorship is that people at the top, or a lot of the time, is that people at the top either wish to implement a certain ideology or wish to effectively enrich themselves. So that doesn't lead to a quick, effective style of government. What that actually leads to a lot of the time is a very corrupt, very slow style of government, as you can see in a lot of countries, for example, in Africa or in Eastern Asia, where actually a dictatorship doesn't make a country's bureaucracy run faster. It just means it's less accessible to everyone within the country.
Right. So you actually made, like, started a fairly simplified, you made a few other points, right? Like, first, like, you're essentially arguing that, like, even if they're better able to enact policy, it doesn't mean the policy will be for the best of the country. But you're also arguing about why some things might not happen at all because they'll be more focused on enriching themselves, right? But indeed, like, saying that this claim, it's exactly what you're doing is attacking the impact, because all of this might be true, but just because they're better able to enact policy doesn't mean they're enacting positive policy. Exactly the link with impact that we were looking for, right? Just because all of the things you said would happen doesn't mean what would happen is a good thing. Anybody else? Oh, you're right. Go ahead.
I think it's something that was just brought up as well. This is, and you mentioned in the beginning that this is probably a good case where you can attack the grounds. Because it is a weak analogous example, and this is probably a place where you can prove against the grounds, because you can say, think of how many examples of dictatorships that you know that are wonderful, strongly, and their economy and really love and help the people.
Yeah.
And how many can you think that are bad? You can think of way more examples easily that are bad. In that case, probably reasonably convinced. Persuade whoever you're trying to persuade.
And if you're doing a debate, it's great to link this in with your argument, because what you are doing is you're attacking examples, like you said, you're attacking the grounds. So by doing that, it's easy to then for the debate to evolve into people throwing examples at each other. The better way to do it, as you were already starting to do, is you point out other examples and then you go, why is that? And then you can go into, because a lot of dictators are a bit more busy murdering people or committing genocide than they are actually busy effectively promoting economic policy, right? Yes.
I would go quality over quantity. Just because a dictator is able to reenact change fast doesn't mean it's good change.
Yeah, well, that's pretty similar to what he said, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because the policy might not be good. Another way to look at this, right? I already did the politically loyal one. You could also argue that development doesn't necessarily mean that it's better off, right? The country might be developing faster, but it might be developing in the wrong direction, what you said, right? But even economic development doesn't have to be a good thing. That's a more anti-consumerist, anti-progressive argument. But there's also opportunities where you talk about, okay, a country might develop faster, but at a high price, right? So they're better able to enact policy because they ignore a lot of restraining factors that we see in normal democracy, things like checking whether policies are like economically, whether they're environmentally friendly, whether they respect people's wages, whether they like really employ a lot of like cheap labor, etc., etc. Okay. On Thursday, we're going to have the refutation workshop. I'm going to be there. It's going to be fun. You can also do it online if you're unable to attend, of course. I know there's some people probably listening to the recording. So for those still in quarantine, that goes as well. Before the workshop, you are expected to make arguments for both sides of two motions. They don't need to be very detailed, and I'm not expecting any essays, but they do need to contain the basic parts of an argument, and they need to be logically sound. We got that? Cool. Thank you for listening.